Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Whalenerds podcast. This is episode number 52. My name is Slater Moore, and I'm here with Eric and Caitlin.
Hey, everyone.
Hello. And we have a special guest.
Yes,
we have Robin Baird on from Cascadia Research Collective. I'm really excited to hear from him about all of his work. He actually does a lot of work out where I am now in the Hawaiian Islands. So if you want to start with just what your current projects are with Cascadia, and then we'll dive into it, Robin, that would be awesome.
Sure. Well, thanks very much for inviting me on, and happy to be here. A lot of the work that I've been doing in recent years has been focusing in Hawaii on a number of different species of odontocetes there. We have active photo ID catalogs of 11 different species of Hawaiian odontocetes, as well as collecting information on movements through satellite tagging, diving behavior also through satellite tagging. And we also have a number of collaborators who are doing work on genetics, both in terms of population structure and social organization. So we collect a lot of biopsy samples and share those with various either PhD students or other collaborators. And in the last couple of years, we've also been using drones to look at behavior and collect breath samples from a few different species. So lots of different things.
Awesome. You guys just finished a project in Kauai like 2 weeks ago, right? And
yeah.
I saw so Jordan Lerma works with you, so we all know him. We got together earlier this summer, so we were kind of talking about some of the work he does with you.
Yeah, the Kauai project ended up being 13 days long. The Kauai work is primarily driven by Navy sonar effects. There's most of the Navy activity in Hawaii occurs off Kauai and Niihau, and we went out there prior to a submarine command course where mid-frequency active sonar is used. Spent a bunch of time on the water trying to put satellite tags out on individuals, primarily to look at how they would then react to sonar exposure during the submarine command course, but also doing a lot of photo ID and biopsy sampling associated with that project.
And is that mainly on all odontocetes, or is that just false killer whales?
That's on all odontocetes. The tags, what species we get tags on really depends on what we encounter out there. Their conditions off Kauai can be pretty restrictive, so we were able to get one tag out on a short fin pilot whale and 2 tags out on bottlenose dolphins. We did see false killer whales one day during the project, but they just weren't quite approachable enough. So, but we're trying to look at all the different species that are exposed to Navy sonar and how they react, and each species uses the area quite differently, and you would expect them to react quite differently to sonar as well.
That's cool. I actually saw some submarines like right while you guys were out in Kauai. They were like over on the Maui side, just like, I don't know if they were staging or what. They were anchored outside of Lahaina Harbor. So it's interesting timing. They must have been getting ready for the exercises.
Yeah.
Now, Robin, what are the actual reactions from most of the species? What do you see happening once, sonar is produced?
Well, it's extremely variable. We've had tags on 4 or 5 different species associated with sonar exercises before, and the species that are known to show really strong reactions to mid-frequency sonar are primarily beaked whales, Cuvier's beaked whales, and Blainville's beaked whales, and Cuvier's we just don't see off of Kauai, even though there's a resident population of them off of Kona. Blainville's beaked whales, we don't see them very often off Kauai, and we've never been able to get a tag out on them prior to one of these exercises. But it's known from work that some collaborators with the Navy are doing using the hydrophone range off Kauai that when sonar is used on the range, the beaked whales basically become silent and move away.
Okay.
And, the other species, it's been interesting. I think one of the key things in terms of understanding the reactions or the lack of reactions is whether or not the animals are resident to the area or part of open ocean populations that are just moving through.
Okay.
And the Navy's been using sonar off Kauai for over 40 years. And so for those species or those populations that are resident to the islands, they have probably been exposed to Navy sonar multiple times a year for their entire lives.
Okay.
And in that case, I think it doesn't come as a real surprise to them when sonar comes on. Compare that to an open ocean animal that be moving over thousands of kilometers and happens to be near Kauai when sonar is used. That animal may never have been exposed to high intensity sonar in the past, and so it's a much more of a surprise. And a lot of the responses then depend on whether or not it's a novel stimulus, and they're reacting to that versus something that they may find aversive and move away from it, but without the type of panic response that may occur in some other species.
Yeah. Okay.
And when the Navy's doing the sonar, how long can that last for?
Well, the projects that we've been doing have been occurring just before the submarine command courses, and the submarine command courses are typically about 2.5 to 3 days long. And the submarine command course, when you think about it, it's basically a training course for submarine commanders. So there's one or two surface vessels that are basically trying to track down a submarine, and the submarine's trying to avoid them. And so the surface vessels are it's sort of a free-flowing type of exercise where the surface vessels, their goal is to try to find the submarine, and the submarine's goal is to try to avoid them. And so they could be using sonar off and on, semi-regularly over that entire 2.5 days. And there's also some evidence, again, this is coming from some collaborators with the Navy who have been using the hydrophone range, that a lot of the animals that are on the range may be just reacting even to the presence of the vessels as they come onto the range prior to the use of sonar. And in particular, blainbills, beaked whales, they seem to move off the range even before the exercise starts.
Wow.
It's probably quite different, those fairly predictable sonar exercises than a Navy vessel that just happens to be transmitting and either transiting, through the area and happens to, turn on their mid-frequency active sonar either to test it or as some sort of short-term training scenario. And different populations, different species are going to react depending on those types of circumstances.
So is the area that is considered the range like an ideal foraging habitat for a lot of those species? Like, do you have an idea of what the disturbance level is when they're on there using that space and then the whales leave?
Yeah, well, and sorry, call's coming in. I'm just going to turn it off so the ringing stops in the background. So we've been doing satellite tagging with a number of different species in Hawaii for many years, and from the tag data, we have a pretty good idea of what areas are important to the different species. So off of Kauai and Niihau in particular, the species that we have a lot of information from are short-fin pilot whales, bottlenose dolphins, and rough-toothed dolphins. And for those three species, and this is based on data that goes back over 5, 6, or 7 years, for those three species, their actual core areas of use happen to coincide pretty consistently with the Navy range. And the Navy can and does use sonar over a very, very large area, but the reason why a lot of these activities off Kauai are concentrated in a relatively small area is because of a hydrophone range they have there, almost 200 bottom-mounted hydrophones. And so we're able to look at overlap between these different populations in terms of their core areas and the hydrophone range, and For all three of those species, bottlenose, rough-toothed dolphins, and short-fin pilot whales, their core area happens to overlap with the range quite considerably. So they definitely, it's an important habitat for them, but it also means that they've had lots of prior exposure.
Yeah, and it's kind of difficult to convince the U.S. Navy to move their operations somewhere else when they've got all that equipment installed there. So we all have to coexist, I guess.
Yeah. I actually think that those particular populations, like I said, they've been exposed to Navy sonar probably for their entire lives, and so I think they react a lot less than naive animals. I would say a better strategy if the Navy really wanted to minimize effects on other populations or on those same species elsewhere is to actually restrict their Navy activities, their sonar use, to one relatively small area. I think when you think about populations off of Kona, for example, where there's a lot of resident species that are known to be susceptible to the impacts of Navy sonar, those are the ones that I think are more at risk from just occasional sonar use off of Hawaii Island.
Yeah. So would you say during the course of like the 2.5 to 3 days that they're using the sonar that there is an observed desensitization? I can't even say it. They're like the animals become more acclimated to the use as it goes on. There's like less reactions over the course of that 2 days, 3 days that they're using it.
Yeah, it's interesting. So for bottlenose dolphins and rough-toothed dolphins and pilot whales, when we've had tagged animals that are exposed to sonar, they're clearly not fleeing the area in any major way. We've had some evidence that they may be moving off the range prior to the sonar use, like I mentioned for the beaked whales. And then for all three species, and also we had one case where we had false killer whales satellite tagged during a Navy exercise. So for all four of those species, we've had animals move closer to the sonar source when the sonar is being used. So I think your question is spot on, that even over a 2.5 day period, they're getting used to the Navy source, and potentially moving it back into areas that are important to them. They're still staying. We're able to work with the Navy scientists, and they're able to. We have the satellite tag data. They know from the hydrophone range when and where sonar is being used. And so we're able to take the sonar data and the satellite tag data and look at exactly what estimated receive levels the animals are hearing when sonar is being used, and they're moving into areas that are well above their hearing range, but they're not moving really close to the vessels. So they're still staying at areas that are below the sound pressure levels that would cause hearing damage, for example.
Okay. Yeah, because I imagine the whole thing's really loud. The boats, the sonar's really loud and obnoxious. So.
And has there been any cases of strandings after these documentations of the sonar being used?
Well, in Hawaii, there's a couple possible cases where sonar has been identified either as the likely cause of a stranding or just happens to be occurring in the same place and same time and might have caused a stranding, but haven't necessarily been investigated in any great detail. The one that's most well known is the Hanalei Bay melon-headed whale event that happened during RIMPAC back in 2004. And in that case, a big group, 150 to 200 melon-headed whales, were seen swimming into Hanalei Bay while sonar was being used to the northwest of Hanalei Bay. And Hanalei Bay, if you're not familiar with it, is right on the north shore of Kauai. It's the largest embayment on the north shore of Kauai. And what's thought to have happened there is that the whales were sort of in the wrong place at the wrong time when sonar started to be used, and their way of escaping that was to move into the shallow waters of the bay. The group did not strand, and once they were detected and they were witnessed coming into the bay in one big wave of animals, the Navy was contacted. The Navy stopped using sonar, and then local residents basically worked together to herd the animals out of the bay.
Oh, wow.
And so that was a really good outcome. Obviously, only one animal ended up stranding, a calf that must have got separated in the chaos of the event. Another case off of Kauai that I think is fairly convincing is a lone dwarf sperm whale. And in that case, the animal ended up stranding just in the mouth of the Kilauea River on the north shore of Hawaii shortly after one of these submarine command courses started up. That animal ended up being euthanized, but when they did the necropsy, it had a full stomach, which implies that it wasn't, debilitated in any way, and it had nothing, no obvious reason why it would have stranded. So I think it was another case where the animal was just trying to get away from sonar. Again, it got in sort of the wrong place at the wrong time, and both melon-headed whales and dwarf sperm whales are not resident to Kauai and Niihau, unlike the species I've mentioned. So for them, I think it was probably a novel experience. That just all of a sudden they're exposed to the sonar and their reaction is to flee, and because of the way they did that, they ended up sort of putting themselves into dangerous situations.
Yeah. Okay. So how long have you been doing these surveys for odontocetes around the Hawaiian Islands? It's been quite a few years, right?
Yeah, I originally moved to Maui back in late 1998. Lived on Maui for about a year and a half, and while there, started up photo ID with false killer whales and bottlenose dolphins. And the work has basically been ongoing ever since. So I think we're in our 22nd year now. And I'm based on the mainland. I've lived in Washington State since 2003, but come out to Hawaii a couple times a year, sometimes 3 or 4 projects a year, sometimes 2 or 3 projects a year. And actually the projects, we have, one project, for example, in 2020, we've had one project on Kauai. We're likely to have one off of Kona, and then another one either off of Lanai or Oahu. So we tend to spread the projects out off different islands. Some of the species move among the islands pretty regularly, things like false killer whales. The endangered resident false killer whales will go all the way from, east of Hawaii Island to west of Niihau. So in theory, you could work off any island and see them, but other species tend to have island-specific populations. So the bottlenose dolphins that are off of Kona are different from the ones off Maui Nui, different from the ones off Oahu, and there's a fourth population off Kauai and Niihau. So in order to try to get information throughout the islands, we have to sort of spread the field efforts around.
Yeah, cool. So with the false killer whales, the insular population, you're working with some collaborators around the islands. And what we've been told at Pacific Whale Foundation is one of the big threats is like depredation in fishing gear and entanglements and things, and stationary fishing gear. Is that kind of what you guys are focusing on, is trying to figure out like what's going on with the population, what are the threats, that kind of thing? It's not so much sonar, it's more other interactions, or is it kind of anything and everything?
Yeah, well, false killer whales in Hawaii tend to feed on the same types of things that humans like to catch. So, mahi-mahi, ono, ahi, mongchong. They also feed on a lot of reef-associated game fish like aluas, bonefish. So basically everything that they're feeding on are also targeted by both recreational fisheries and commercial fisheries in Hawaii, and that's where the conflict comes from. And false killer whales, if they see a fish on the end of a line, they're well known to take those fish from fishermen, and some probably very, very small percentage of the time that happens, they can get hooked as a result. So fishery interactions, I think, are likely the biggest threat to the population by far. And back in the 80s, the false killer whale population in Hawaii was much, much larger, and at that time happened to correspond with when the longline fishery was rapidly expanding in Hawaii. Back up until about 1991, 1992, longline fishing could occur quite close to shore. There were no sort of limits around the islands that affected where they could fish, and I think that false killer whales were regularly taking fish from long lines. It's something that was documented as early in Hawaii as 1963, and probably a lot of the population reduction happened back in the 80s and 90s. Nowadays, they certainly take fish from fishermen, and we're trying to get an idea of what proportion of the individuals in the population are involved in those types of events. So one of the things we're doing is looking at the mouth lines of individuals. So if when they're surfacing, if the head comes out of the water, we try to get head photos from folks who are in the water with them that contribute photos to our catalogs. We're able to look at mouth line injuries from those as well. And the mouth line injuries sometimes are extremely obvious that the animal has been hooked in the mouth, and basically that line has pulled out.
Yeah.
So from that, almost a quarter of the individuals in the endangered population have evidence of being previously hooked.
Mm.
So it's a pretty high proportion of individuals in the population. But we're also trying to just understand how not only what the threats that the population is facing, but how they're doing in terms of what the reproductive rates are, what the mortality rates are, is the population increasing or decreasing, and that relies on photographs. And one thing I think is really important in Hawaii are the contributions of folks who work on the water or play on the water. We have a lot of citizen science contributions off all the islands. People who are have the opportunity to get photos when they're either running tours, or we get some photos from commercial fishermen or professional photographers or just amateur photographers. A lot of folks send in photos, and that really makes a big difference. We have a grant right now that we're working on where we're buying 14 camera systems, and we're trying to get them to fishermen in Hawaii that are
cool.
interested in contributing. So that's something we're slowly working on as well.
That's awesome. If people do have photos, how should they get them to Cascadia or get them to you? Should they email them, or is there like a protocol? Or
yeah, well, we use it works differently for different people depending on how tech savvy they are, but folks send them to us through Dropbox or through Hightail. Some folks who don't have good internet connections will get them a flash drive, and they can just mail the flash drive to us. If someone has been working on the water and has a lot of photos, then that's often the easiest way of doing it.
Sure.
We sending them by email. The problem is, really
compressed.
Yeah. But our email address for anyone who wants to contact us is just hawaii@cascadiaresearch.org. So it's that comes to Sabra Mahaffey and I. The Sabra is in charge of our photo ID most of our photo ID catalogs, and we also try to give feedback to people who submit photos. So if someone sends us a photo of Blainville's beaked whale, we'll match it quickly to our catalog and let them know whether it's a new individual or an individual that's been seen many times over the years, and provide some information on the sighting history. We just posted something this morning on Cascadia's Facebook page about a bottlenose dolphin that was photographed just over a week ago off of Oahu. It's the same individual that we've been monitoring now for about 2 years.
I saw that.
Yeah, it was shot in the head.
Yeah.
And we know that because of citizen science photos. It was first photographed by folks on Oahu that the whole sighting history of this particular calf comes from either tour operators or photographers from Oahu that have been sending in photos. So it's really an amazing opportunity for us to learn more about the animals from those types of contributions.
Oh, that's awesome. I remember when the photos came out a couple years ago, I couldn't believe that animal was going to survive. And here it is, 2 years later since the first report, right? That's incredible.
Yeah. And I mean, the bullet wound went right through the head, right above in front of the melon, in the front part of the melon, above the skull. So it's still, it is phenomenal that the animal survived. I think one of the reasons why it probably survived is it was a nursing calf when it was shot, and actually still seems to be acting like it's being provisioned from its mom. So I think that the question still remains is when it's finally weaned and on its own, whether or not there was any damage to its ability to echolocate and find prey. So it's something that we're just going to be really interested to follow over time.
Yeah.
And so for something like the Blainville, from a photo ID aspect, is it dorsal fin or is it modeling, or is it both?
Yeah, it's both. Some species it's primarily pigmentation, and others it's primarily dorsal fins. But Blainville's beaked whales in Hawaii, and this also applies to Cuvier's beaked whales, get bitten a lot by cookie cutter sharks, and the scars remain visible for up to 20 years or more. So they unlike other species, pilot whales or false killer whales, when they're bitten by cookie cutter sharks, the wounds end up re-pigmenting to the same as the background color, whereas in beaked whales they basically pigment as gray or white. So you can use that spotting pattern to identify individuals, similar to the way you could use pigmentation in blue whales to identify them. And it means that unlike most of the other species, you need a perpendicular dorsal fin shot. But for both species of beaked whales, we can get photos from almost any angle and still have if it's an adult or a subadult with lots of scars, still have a good chance of matching it to our catalog.
That's good to know. Yeah. So you mentioned earlier that you have some grants you're working on, and then I'm assuming the Navy also helps fund some of your work as well, because it's part of their obligation to do environmental assessments. How do you typically fund your work? Those two sources, or are there other ways you guys are able to get funding?
Yeah, well, I spend way more time than I would like to writing grant proposals.
I feel like every scientist says that.
yeah, pretty much. We have funding from National Marine Fisheries Service. We have a grant from the Pacific Island Fisheries Science Center in Honolulu, and that particular grant includes funding for a lot of our photo ID work. It helps fund one of the people in the office pretty much full time doing catalog work. We also been getting these contracts from the Navy specifically for the work off Kauai, but over the years have also received Navy funding through Office of Naval Research, or another program in the Navy called the LMR, Living Marine Resources program, and that has funded various types of work. It's funded work specifically with beaked whales off of Kona. It's funded work with tag development. We've also received some funding from Northwest Fisheries Science Center in Seattle, which specifically to collect breath samples from a couple different species of odontocete using a drone. And we've had some grants from various nonprofit groups. Groups like Dolphin Quest in Hawaii have been giving us funding for a number of years for various aspects of the work. Last year, they helped fund a project that's looking at epigenetic aging in false killer whales.
Cool.
And we're still awaiting the results of that work, but it was something that was very difficult to get. It's still at a fairly, epigenetic aging is is a fairly new technique as it's applied to whales and dolphins. It hasn't been done with very many species, and so in that sense, it's a little bit experimental at this stage. Dolphin Quest actually gave us another grant late last year to buy satellite tags that could be put on stranded animals in Hawaii, that live strand. And there's this question, of course, when there's a live stranding of what's the likelihood of the animal surviving? Should it be euthanized or should it be returned to the water? And we're going to be buying 8 satellite tags, make those available to all the stranding response folks. And then if they have an animal they think that could be returned to the water, they would have a tag that they could then put on, and that would help understand, how the animal survived, where it went afterwards. It could potentially be used to allow for follow-up of these stranded animals that have been returned to the water. So another nonprofit foundation has given us funding for some educational work in the past. We bought copies. I published a book a couple years ago through University of Hawaii Press on whales and dolphins in Hawaiian waters, and one of the things the grant included was distributing copies of that book to all the high schools in Hawaii, as well as to a number of Native Hawaiian environmental organizations. So just making it available as a resource for students and for others in Hawaii. So a lot of grant writing.
Yeah. Yeah. This struggle. I took a technical writing class in college, but I don't think most science majors are like required to do that. And then you become a researcher and you're like, oh no. So you have authored and co-authored a couple different books. Is the Whales and Dolphins of Hawaii the most recent one, or do you have some other ones that have you done lately? I know there's been a few.
Yeah, well, the most recent is a chapter in a book specifically on beaked whales, and it focuses, or it basically summarizes everything we've learned about Cuvier's and Blainville's beaked whales in Hawaiian waters over the years, and that came out last year. The Whales and Dolphins of Hawaii book is certainly the broadest resource available for any species in Hawaiian waters. But no, I actually have just been talking with University of Hawaii Press about putting together a proposal for a field guide to marine mammals in Hawaii that would be something that's smaller. People could easily take it out on boats with them, but that'll be a few years away, I think.
Awesome. So if you looked back at all the work you've done, what would you say is probably the most meaningful or most informative project that you've been able to finish and publish and maybe inform management with?
Yeah, well, the false killer whale work certainly is up there, I think, as the most influential on management. We started working with false killer whales. Well, actually, back in the late 80s and early 90s, I was one of the stranding coordinators for a stranded whale and dolphin program in British Columbia, and we had the opportunity to do necropsies on a couple false killer whales that stranded, one in 87 and one in 89. And so ever since then, I've actually been interested in that species. And one of the reasons why I originally moved to Hawaii is because of the opportunity to work with false killer whales. Our work originally started out just looking at photo identification. I think the first report that we published on false killer whales about 2004 or so had an abundance estimate based on mark recapture that suggested the population was quite small. We had been collecting biopsy samples as well in the early 2000s and collaborated with researchers at Southwest Fisheries Science Center, and that early genetic work showed that the false killer whales around the main Hawaiian Islands appeared to be different from false killer whales elsewhere in the world. And we published something in 2005 that showed high levels of injuries on the dorsal fins that suggest they were involved in fisheries interactions. So, a combination of the population being small, genetically isolated, high levels of fisheries interactions. When information began coming out around 2008, 2009, that the population appeared to have declined quite a bit, that's actually what led to the original petition by NRDC to list false killer whales as endangered or under the Endangered Species Act. And so that triggered the National Marine Fisheries Service to begin their assessment of the population, and that report by NOAA came out in 2010, and that report basically said the population is distinct, it's at risk of extinction, and that eventually led to the listing in 2012. So it was a clear case where you do the science has strong management implications, and in that case, NOAA Fisheries acted and ended up listing the population. A couple of years ago, they released critical habitat for false killer whales in Hawaii, and that critical habitat, those areas are based almost entirely on our satellite tagging work. So it's another good example of where the science was used to designate critical habitat and potentially provide additional protection for the animals. That said, part of your original question is, completing something, and clearly the process isn't complete. There's lots that need to be done to provide additional protection for false killer whales in Hawaii, and that's a much more difficult thing to address, because it's, how do you deal with fisheries interactions? There's no good solution to that. The other thing that's been going on with false killer whales in Hawaii is with the pelagic population and the bycatch in the longline fishery, and I mentioned restrictions on where longline fishing can occur went into effect back in 1991, 1992. So now longline fishing is excluded around the main Hawaiian Islands, but the pelagic population overlaps quite extensively with the longline fleet, and bycatch in that fishery is not sustainable. Mm-hmm. So there's been an effort now for more than 10 years through the false killer whale take reduction team to try to find solutions to the bycatch problem in the longline fishery, and the efforts they're just not working. We came up with a plan to use weaker types of hooks, circle hooks, and stronger branch lines, with the idea is that if a false killer whale got hooked on a line, the hook would be the weakest link, so it could potentially straighten that hook and get off. And all the evidence that's coming in suggests that the current configuration just isn't working. So there's definitely still a lot more that needs to be done.
Yeah. Well, that's pretty awesome, though, that it led to them being listed. That's a big deal.
Yeah, and it's nice. So I'm Canadian originally. I'm born and raised in Canada, and worked in both Eastern and Western Canada for a long time, and focusing my work in the U.S. the last 22 years. The nice thing about the U.S. is that the laws that are in place, both the Marine Mammal Protection Act and the Endangered Species Act, and then the ability of groups like Earth Justice or NRDC or Center for Biological Diversity to sue the government when they're not following their own laws. All of those things really provide a mechanism where science can get translated into conservation and management. And a lot of other countries around the world, there's some great science going on, and there may or may not be some good laws in place that in theory provide protection, but there's often a bit of a disconnect between how quickly or whether that science actually gets utilized the way it really is meant to be utilized.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have a rough estimate of what the population might have been in the 60s and then what it is now?
Yeah, so for false killer whales around the main Hawaiian Islands, there was a survey that found groups that of upwards of 380, 400 individuals off of Kohala, off Hawaii Island. And those groups that were seen were not necessarily the entire population all present in one place at one time, but the area where they were seen is an area that we know from our satellite tagging work is one of the real high density areas for false killer whales today. The most recent abundance estimate from 2015 is about 170 individuals. So the population probably went down from 400 to 500 or more to less than 200, and we don't really have a good handle on the trend in the population in the last 20 years, in part because we just don't see them often enough, and folks who live on, or who work on the water aren't seeing them often enough to really have very precise abundance estimates. So the abundance estimates jump up and down from year to year, and that variability doesn't necessarily mean the population is going up and down quickly. It just means that the estimates are not precise enough to really look at the more recent trend.
Okay.
Yeah, the last time I was in Maui a couple weeks ago, we had a few individuals, like probably about 12 of them, pass through the area while we were looking at a mom and calf humpback pair, and but they were spread out over a course of like a mile, so we didn't get like an exact number of how many were there, but it's probably around like 15, it seemed like. But during that encounter, these false killer whales came right to the area with this mom and calf, and the mom and calf took off, and you could see their fluke prints across the surface, the mom and calves, and then we didn't see them again. Have you heard about false killer whales harassing humpback whales at all?
Yeah, well, we've certainly seen false killer whales swimming around humpbacks on a few occasions, and typically when that's happened, the humpbacks appear agitated, so a lot of forced blows. But it's funny because we've, a lot of different species of odontocetes will do that with larger whales. I was working off of Nova Scotia many years ago through Dalhousie University, and we had long-fin pilot whales that were harassing northern bottlenose whales, and the smaller, more maneuverable pilot whales were harassing the larger bottlenose whales, and then the same group of bottlenose whales later on started harassing a fin whale, and and it's sort of like they're taking out their frustration of being harassed by the pilot whales on this
That's funny.
larger fin whale that just wasn't able to do anything about it. So same kind of thing of seeing bottlenose dolphins that sometimes are beating up on smaller species, or I've seen Pacific white-sided dolphins beating up on a harbor porpoise before, and for these species that have interactions with other species, sometimes they're mutual, and other times they're not.
Yeah, because especially off Southern California, we see gray whales interact with common dolphins, offshore and coastal bottlenose dolphins, and they always seem to be a very playful encounter.
Yeah. We've seen humpback whales and bottlenose dolphins, in particular juvenile humpback whales, but and bottlenose dolphins off Kauai regularly interacting, and often the humpbacks are not only bottlenose dolphins, but pilot whales and rough-toothed dolphins all interacting with humpbacks. And often the humpbacks seem to be following the odontocetes around and instigating the interactions to some degree. So I think a lot of it depends. A mother and calf would be a good example of where, she just wants to spend time with the calf and protect the calf, and so the kind of avoidance you saw makes sense compared to many other types of circumstances.
Yeah, it's all in context, and it's hard to interpret sometimes.
Yeah.
So you mentioned that you did some work with Dalhousie University, and then you're originally Canadian and have been doing a lot of work in the U.S., but how did it all start? I know a lot of people kind of ask us or ask our guests, how'd you get started in this field?
Yeah, for me, it was really a college course I was taking in Victoria, British Columbia, at Camosun College, a little community college. I took a summer ecology class, and our instructor took us on a field trip over to San Juan Island to visit the Whale Museum, and we got a lecture from a researcher there. We went out to the west side of San Juan Island and watched killer whales go by. He also was involved, as well as one of the people from the Whale Museum in Friday Harbor, at setting up a nonprofit group in Victoria called the International Cetacean Watch Society, now defunct. But he encouraged the students in his ecology class to get involved, and so I started volunteering with that group, I think in probably about 1983. And through that, we did things like invite people in to give talks, but we also had an opportunity to volunteer for researcher Mike Bigg, who's doing killer whale work.
Mm-hmm.
In starting in about 1986, started collecting photos for Mike's killer whale catalog, and we did that through this nonprofit group. We bought a little 14-foot aluminum boat and a 20 horsepower Johnson outboard engine, and a professor at the university donated some life jackets to us. I sold my girlfriend and I both sold our dive gear and bought camera gear, and Mike would pay for the film and the developing, and so just started going out in the water and contributing photos for him, and that led. Then this was back in prior to the days of commercial whale watching in the area. There was at that point one tour operator that ran out of Friday Harbor. And in 1987, a tour operator opened up in Victoria, the first one on the Canadian side of the border. And he would, my girlfriend at the time, she got a job working for him as a naturalist, and I got a job working for him as a driver, driving 12-passenger Zodiacs. And it was a fairly relaxed setup. So if we had a group of passengers that didn't need to get back at the end of their 3-hour trip, and we had a really good encounter, we would just stay out longer.
We would all stay out longer.
Yeah. So actually started collecting data while out on these whale watching trips, getting photos and recording behavioral information on what the whales are doing. That ended up being part of my PhD work through Simon Fraser University on foraging behavior of mammal-eating killer whales. So, while I was a graduate student, we started up the stranding network in British Columbia. So got involved in stranding response and necropsies and collecting samples for various researchers, and that led to a lot of different sort of side projects as well.
That's cool. So it all started on the west coast of Canada, and then you kind of just stayed on the west coast most of the time, except Dalhousie's on the east coast, right?
Yeah, I after finishing my PhD, I moved around a little bit. I lived in Mexico for 8 months. I then went back up to British Columbia, then got the postdoc at Dalhousie, so I spent 3 years in Nova Scotia. But even during the time in Nova Scotia, I was going back to the west coast to continue work with killer whales. I did some work with killer whales in Iceland, a short project off Japan, a project off Italy, a project off New Zealand. So got to travel around quite a bit and work with a lot of different researchers doing different types of things, but still, up until maybe about 5 years ago, continued some of the work with killer whales in the Pacific Northwest, but now all of my time and effort is concentrated in Hawaii.
Awesome. So you've been on the water for a long time in many cool places. If you had to pick like a few encounters that were like the most exciting or the most unique, like what do you have any that you immediately comes to mind?
For me, I think probably false killer whale encounter off of off of Kona was probably the most interesting one, although it's a long list really. But the encounter was particularly interesting because it's the first time that I got to see some really interesting prey sharing occurring, and in that particular case, the whales were really spread out. We were following one animal, and it ended up catching I think it was a mahi-mahi. It was just carrying the mahi-mahi around, and shortly after it caught the mahi-mahi, other animals started to converge, and that the individual that caught the mahi-mahi passed the intact fish to a second individual. It passed the fish to a third individual, and then that one passed it back to the one that caught it. And it wasn't until it was passed back to the one that caught it that they actually started to eat the fish. And then all three of them ended up eating the fish, and that was certainly an extremely memorable encounter. Not just it's exciting to see them catch anything, but the whole concept that they're sharing this fish in a way that's a little bit different than most species. If you see rough-toothed dolphin sharing a fish, it's like one rough-toothed dolphin holding in a fish and another one coming and grabbing a piece off, kind of thing. Whereas this was a little bit more symbolic, I think. They were passing it around to their buddies, to their hunting companions, and no one was actually eating it. And the fact that they were doing that, I think, reflects the really strong social bonds that species shares. And I think it also reflects on how important trust is within those types of cooperative hunters. They have to basically trust that they're, if their hunting buddy catches something, that they're actually going to share it, and not just sneak away and eat it all themselves. So, and since then I've seen that kind of behavior a few different times, but that was definitely one of the highlights.
That's awesome. Well, so what's next as you continue to move forward? Obviously, you're still writing grants at home in dreary Washington. And so you said there's probably a project coming off of Kona and maybe off of Lanai. Is that the plan to do the work in Hawaii for now?
Yeah, well, we have a big team of folks working at Cascadia on our Hawaii projects. So in the office, we have 2 people working full-time on photo ID catalogs, as well as 1 or more interns helping out with the photo ID catalogs. So there's a lot going on in terms of matching individuals and adding them to the catalog. We have someone who is currently analyzing some of our tag data, looking at doing these movement models of animals associated with sonar exposure. We have Jordan Lerma, who you mentioned earlier. Jordan is in charge of our drone program, and he's in the middle of working up our data from some of our photogrammetry that we've been doing with false killer whales and pilot whales using the drone. And over the next few months, I'm hoping to use it as an opportunity to get a lot of writing done. There's really just sort of an endless number of things that need to be written up. Before our call today, I was working on a manuscript with a co-author on dwarf sperm whales. It's for a book chapter on European mammals that was actually due a couple months ago, but we're making progress. And I have a long list of manuscripts that I want to write up. It's something that one of my professors when I was in university mentioned. If it's not published, it was never done, was his quote. And there's a lot of people who collect a lot of information, a lot of data, a lot of photos, a lot of samples, and the key part is not just collecting it, but it's actually getting everything analyzed and written up and out there so that other people can then build on that kind of work. So I enjoy the writing part of it. I just wish I had more time to do it, really.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, it's kind of hard to do you want to write? Do you want to go in the field? For me, I'd rather be in the field, but both are important.
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. Well, that's I think all the questions I had. Do you guys have any other ones?
Slater.
I was just thinking for like our listeners, because there's a lot of people that are in college right now. Do you have any recommendations on how they can get started? But I mean, you kind of said it yourself. Volunteering is obviously a good way to get into the field, right?
Yeah, and it's funny because nowadays there's internship programs and a lot of people spend time doing that kind of volunteer work. But I was doing that 30 years ago as well, and so it's not really a new phenomenon. I can definitely attribute a lot of what I'm able to do today and have been doing for a long time to just spending a lot of hours trying to learn new things and help out other researchers and get opportunities. So that's definitely part of it. But I think that there's so many different types of ways of getting into the field. Part of it, if you look at what's limiting, honestly, it's things like skills in modeling and statistics and using R. I would highly recommend anyone who's in college now, if they're not, if they don't use R for stats or for modeling, they should start. It's better to start that kind of thing when you're young. And on the other hand, I would also, and I've said this for many years, I think if you're not a birder, you should become a birder. Birders tend to be really good observers. They are always paying attention to small details. And I was a birder before I got into marine mammals, and I think that that's been something that's really valuable in terms of honing my observational skills over the years. You're trying to spot and figure out what small, fast-moving things are, and that can be really important when you're witnessing something that's happening really quickly on the water, or something that's really distant, and being able to pick up on those really subtle cues that you may only have a brief opportunity to do. So
yeah,
those are my two suggestions: learn to program in R and become a bird.
Speaking of birds, didn't your projects have a bunch of incidental observations of storm petrels, and you were able to help distinguish one species into two species a few years ago?
Yeah, well, we certainly record birds while we're out on the water, and we always have. And we contributed all of our bird photos to a researcher in California, Peter Pyle. I think you're particularly referring to a paper that Peter published a few years ago. There's 3 or 4 different species of storm petrels in Hawaiian waters, but 2 of them look very similar: band rump storm petrels and Leach's storm petrels. And once digital cameras became available, and in our case, usually I'm driving the boat, and so if we see a storm petrel, we will follow it and have multiple people trying to get photos of it. And this applies to other species of birds as well, any rare or unusual species. And what Peter was able to do is take these series, sometimes of 100 or more photos of one bird, and instead of doing what most people have done, which is you take one photo, or you take 100 photos and you send one of the photos, the best one, to someone to identify, and they say it's so-and-so. What Peter would do is he would look at each photo independently and say, based on what I can see in this photo, I would call this a band rump storm petrel, or I'd call this a Leach's storm petrel. And what he discovered is that in 100 photos of a band rump storm petrel, there may be 3 or 4 of them that, depending on the angle, actually look like a Leach's storm petrel, and the same goes the other direction. So it sort of emphasized that even when you're 100% confident of what species it is, because you've got 100 photos of it, that your ability to accurately identify it is going to depend on the angle of the photos, and so it's just a small example of the kinds of things that, and we're out there studying whales and dolphins, but we're also taking photos when we can and contributing them to bird researchers, and they can be quite valuable that way. So we've also been along the same lines. We collect squid, and we've been that we find floating dead at the surface, and we've collected probably 140 dead squid over the years, at least 20 different species of squid in Hawaii that we've collected, and that includes one species that's not yet been described. It's a Onychia, used to be called Moroteuthis, but it's a genus of squid that prior to our first collections of them, probably 12, 15 years ago now, was thought to be just a temperate water squid. And we started collecting these. We collected 3 on our last project in November. We started collecting these, and it's a new species in that genus that is just sort of awaiting formal description. And we've also collected some squid in Hawaii that it's the first record from Hawaii of that species, or the second record, and so it's been a really all of these little things you can do that contribute in small ways, but they slow, build up over time, and it's a really valuable contribution.
Cool.
Yeah.
Awesome. We're all in unison.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for taking the time to talk to us. It was pretty exciting to get a researcher on that has done such interesting work, and even in my own area that I've been working in. So I learned a few things today, so that's pretty fun.
My pleasure.
Yeah. Any last thoughts or questions? Are we all good?
Slater, did you get any photos of those false killer whales? If so, we'd like to get them.
I honestly got one photo. No, I didn't. Nothing like, no, not ideal really. Maybe
The 2 times
I'll
I've
look
seen
through
them,
it
I've
again.
not had a camera.
It was literally at sundown, like so.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And it
Well,
happened
and
fast.
one thing I'll add, for anyone who works off of California, Cascadia actually has a photo ID catalog from the west coast of Central America, Costa Rica, Nicaragua, and collaborates with researchers in Mexico and folks off California. So if anyone sees false killer whales along the west coast, we'd also be very interested in photos for that catalog. So.
Oh, cool.
I don't
Awesome.
even know if I could find my photos at first. I saw them off California, but man, it had to have been like 2012. I wasn't good at taking pictures then.
Awesome. Well, thanks for taking time to and good luck with all of your writing while you're home in Washington. And maybe I'll see you next fall in the Hawaiian Islands.
Yeah, sounds good. Well, thanks very much. Good talking
Yeah,
to you all.
Great. Thank you, Robin.
Thank you.
All right, take care.
Bye.
Thank you guys so much for listening to this podcast. Hope you enjoyed all that information from Robin Baird. If you want to follow along with their research, it's Cascadia Research, I believe, on Instagram and Facebook as well. And then if you guys don't follow us on Instagram, you're pretty much missing out. It's the Whalenerds on all platforms now, right?
At Whalenerds.
Yeah, at Whalenerds.
Yeah. Just at Whalenerds. And our Facebook page, we're getting caught up on all of our episodes, but also posting links to like how to sign up for Marmam and internships and volunteer opportunities. And so that'll be pretty exciting. Once we're all caught up with episodes, we'll also share all the links of things that we reference throughout episodes too, so you can access them there, because it's a little easier to share online through Facebook for that content.
Hey, let me tell you something.
What?
Justin Timberlake told them to drop the on the Facebook. Okay?
So we dropped the on the Whalenerds. It's just at Whalenerds.
Yeah. All right. Thank you guys and have a great day.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.